great honour and delight for me to be able to come here today to talk to you on UK public perception of nuclear power. So, the nuclear industrial strategy demonstrates the government's commitment to new nuclear power generation in the UK energy mix out to 2050. Indeed, this commitment is being demonstrated by the recent decision to go ahead and build 2 EPR pressurised water reactors at Hinkley Point C. My hypothesis is that the government's decision to go ahead with a new nuclear build in the UK is misaligned with public opinion. So my next slide will investigate how true this is, and the rest of my talk will discuss the reasons for any misalignment. So this slide shows results from a recent UK Energy Research Centre survey on attitudes towards nuclear power. As you can see, about 32% of people say overall they support nuclear power, about 29% say they oppose, and 27% aren't sure, they sit on the fence. So opinion is really split, which is, some might say, is at odds with the government's decision to go ahead with nuclear new build in the UK. So I think we need to investigate what the public consider to be important regarding their energy, first off. So this table shows results from a recent Nuclear Energy Agency survey, and it gives an insight into the issues Europeans see as important and the relative positioning of such issues. As you can see, 1/3 of people rated energy price as the most important, more than double the number of people that chose renewable energy. This demonstrates the importance that the public place on cost and affordability of energy supply, and indeed affordability is one of the major issues facing new nuclear build in the UK. With the importance of energy cost in mind, let's look at the results of an NEA survey which asked the European public, what do you expect will be the top 3 energy sources in the next 30 years? So I find it interesting that the 3 most common answers to this question are also the most costly. These costs are put into perspective by the fact that energy elsewhere in the world is far cheaper. Indeed, INEOS has recently agreed a deal for nuclear power in France at about £38 per megawatt hour, nearly 1/3 of the UK price. It's an unfortunate fact that electricity in the UK is really expensive. It's more expensive than Germany, it's more expensive than France, and it's much, much more expensive than America. And this is the first major point of my talk, that the perception that nuclear energy is expensive for the UK is indeed a true one, but countries like France, who have one of the highest proportions of nuclear energy generation, also have some of the lowest energy prices in Europe. Electricity in the UK seems to be expensive regardless of whether or not it's nuclear or not. Of course, shale gas has been in the news recently, and we could have cheaper electricity by, for example, exploiting shale gas. But then there's the issue of burning fossil fuels to consider, and the related CO2 emissions. So the UK government is committed to cutting CO2 emissions to 1/5 by 2050. As you can see from that green line on the plot there, that's a really drastic drop in CO2 emissions over the next 50 or so years. We've got to minimise fossil fuel power stations in the energy mix. And unfortunately, at the moment, globally, fossil fuel seems to be on the increase. So for the UK, really, fossil fuels are out. But that still leaves solar, wind, and nuclear. So is renewable energy the future for the UK? So I'm going to make an argument here using a couple of case studies. So case study 1, you can see I focus on the Sudan, which is got quite a low population density, nice wide open spaces, and it requires 0.01 watts per square metre to satisfy its energy demand. You can see top left up there the average power output per unit area provided by wind, onshore wind farms and solar farms. So bear in mind this is the average, so peak incident solar is about an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude higher. But when you consider averaging over day-night and converting to actual electrical power, those numbers are pretty accurate, I think. And I referenced the material there. So to satisfy the Sudan's requirement using wind farms alone, about 0.5% of Sudan's surface would have to be dedicated to wind farms. Or, to satisfy using solar farms alone, about 0.2% of Sudan's surface. So, for comparison, currently for the UK, about 1.2% of the land area is occupied by buildings, and 1.5% is occupied by road. So my point here is that even though 0.5% and 0.2% for Sudan seem like very low numbers, when you compare to the number of buildings and roads we know in the UK, that 0.5% and 0.2% are actually quite a large amount of area. But what amount of area would we need to devote in the UK to wind and solar? So using the same calculations before, we're saying about 63% of the UK's surface dedicated as wind farms, or about 25% of the UK's surface dedicated as solar farms, which is just so high it's unbelievable and not really a credible solution for the UK. So this brings me to the second major point in my talk, that the perception that renewables like solar and wind are viable alternatives to nuclear. That's the perception. In the UK, we simply don't have the space to build enough onshore wind farms and solar farms to satisfy UK energy demand. The best we can ever hope for is a mix of nuclear and renewables. So now let's go back to our survey and ask the conditional question. Are you in favour of building new nuclear power stations if it would help to tackle climate change? So we moved from about 30% of people being in favour to nearly 50%, a significant increase. So this is another important conclusion of my presentation, that support for nuclear power is generally correlated with the level of knowledge and experience of nuclear energy within that country. So this slide is about perception of risks. Surveys showed that the public were concerned about nuclear terrorism, radioactive waste disposal, nuclear proliferation, and safe reactor operation. About half of Europeans think that waste cannot be disposed of safely, and around 80% thought that terrorism was a significant threat. In all cases, perception of risk was more favourable towards nuclear if that country had nuclear plants operating in that country. So again, building on my earlier point, we see that support is correlated with the level of knowledge and experience of nuclear energy in that country. And what I found surprising from this plot is that if you look at the average, only about 59% of Europeans thought that a nuclear power plant could be operated safely. I find this surprising because the last significant nuclear power accident in Europe was Chernobyl in 1986. Fatality estimates do vary, but deaths due to cancer from that single incident are attributed to be around the 10,000 mark. However, for 2010 alone, a Clean Air Task Force estimate put the worldwide estimate for fatalities due to pollution from coal plants for that year as 13,200. I find it remarkable that the world's worst nuclear reactor accident caused fewer fatalities than those caused in a single year from coal power plants. And indeed, in addition, coal plants actually release more radioactivity into the atmosphere than nuclear power plants do. So my point here is that nuclear risks need to be put into context. When considering the risks of nuclear power, you've always got to compare to something else. So I've talked about how knowledge and experience of nuclear is really important in public perception. And of course, this will also be important if the right skill set is to be available for new civil nuclear build in the UK. And indeed, I'm using this plot of UK research and development funding for fission as a fraction of total energy research and development as a barometer of our knowledge in the UK, knowledge and experience in the UK of civil nuclear. And as you can see, we fall behind many other countries. Okay, so UK is on the far left there. And compare us to the likes of Australia and Italy, who have a higher red bar than us, but no blue bar, which means we're behind funding fission R&D, behind even those countries that have no nuclear power. The industrial strategy talks about the government's intention to contribute funding for increased research and development into fission, so increasing that red bar. Now, the physicist in me says this is a really good thing, but if I force myself to think more holistically, I do actually worry about this decision. New nuclear build in the UK stands the greatest chance of success if established reactor designs, such as the EPR design, are built again and again and again with no design changes between build. I fear that this research and development money may be wasted on research into designing reactors that don't really stand much of a chance of ever being built. I think the perception here is that more research and development into fission will produce a skill set we need for new nuclear build. Instead, I think the reality is we'll probably produce a load of really good physicists with a great drive and determination to realise new reactor designs and maybe even restore the UK's reputation as civil nuclear pioneers. But I think the skill set for a new build of established reactor design, such as the EPR design, consists of project managers, safety case engineers, mechanical, electrical and systems engineers, and many others. Most of these engineering skill sets exist at Rolls-Royce and AWE, and there'll be huge competition in the coming years for these skills. So back to this plot, I'm certainly not averse to moving the red bar for the UK along, but maybe to 6% like in the US, because we must remember that fission reactors are a 60-year-old technology and there's only so much more new research that can be done. If the aim is to produce physicists with skills in nuclear, personally, I'd spend the research and development money on boosting UK involvement in high-profile international nuclear and particle physics collaborations like ATLAS at the CERN Large Hadron Collider. So in conclusion, energy cost in the UK is very high. It's not just nuclear. Civil perception in the UK, I think, suffers due to the perception that there are apparent alternatives, such as renewables, and that risks are never put into context for nuclear. I think I've shown that perception of nuclear generally improves with greater knowledge and experience. I think it's really important that we have directed and appropriate investment in key skills area. We can't just throw money at research and development and expect to develop the skill set we need. We've got to understand what we need. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think social science has got a massive job here to do in improving public perception of nuclear. I think the technical justification for civil nuclear in the UK is beyond question, and it's important that social science, that we interact with the social scientists to get that message across. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening.